To the outside world, Darnell Jones was a father in agony. On the night of May 19th, he wasn't just a parent. He was a grieving man on the front lines, begging for his 13-year-old daughter to come home. He stood before cameras, his voice breaking, as he described the last time he saw Kei'Mani. He spoke of a stranger danger world, of a kidnapping that didn't make sense, and of a hole in his heart that only her return could fill. For 3 days, the city of Toledo, Ohio, didn't sleep. Neighbors, teachers, and total strangers scoured every alleyway and abandoned lot. They were looking for a monster in the shadows, a boogeyman who had snatched a bright, innocent girl off the street. But while the city was looking outward, the real monster was standing right in the middle of the search party. He was the one holding the flashlight. He was the one directing the volunteers. And he was the one who knew exactly where Kei'Mani was, because he was the reason she was gone. In this case, we aren't just uncovering a murder. We are dissecting the ultimate betrayal. How does a father go from a protector to a predator? And how did a secret evidence locker finally break a man who thought he had committed the perfect crime? This is the heartbreaking story of Kei'Mani Latigue. Kei'Mani's body was found on the second floor of a vacant, burned house. Today, we are going back to Elm Street. We are going to the house where Kei'Mani disappeared, the search that followed, the abandoned building where she was found, and the courtroom where the truth is still being fought over. Tell us where you're watching from. And if this case already makes you angry, stay with us, because the details only get harder to hear. If you believe stories like Kei'Mani's should never be ignored, take 1 second to like this video, subscribe to Dark Trace Crime Stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because this story is not just painful, it is infuriating. May 19th started like any other spring day for 13-year-old Kei'Mani. She was known for her smile, the kind that lit up a room and made her the favorite among her peers. She was a 7th grader at Spring Elementary School. She was known as a student, a basketball player, and a young girl who moved between school, home, and the people who cared for her. Her mother, Tiara Caston, described her routine in the simplest way: school, basketball, home. That was Kei'Mani's world. At school, she had recently been recognized during an honor roll assembly. She was also expected to receive a kindness award, the kind of recognition that says something about a child beyond grades. But by 6 p.m. that evening of May 19th, the light in her house had gone out. The first signs that something was wrong came from a house. The home was on the 2000 block of Elm Street in Toledo, Ohio, the place where Kei'Mani Latigue lived with her grandmother, Dorothy Latigue. It was supposed to be the place she returned to after school, the place where her routine made sense. School, basketball, home. But by the morning of March 18th, 2025, that routine had broken. Kei'Mani had reportedly last been seen by family around the night of March 16th. At first, there may have still been room for hope. The kind of hope every family holds on to when they are trying not to say the worst out loud. Maybe she was nearby. Maybe her phone was dead. Maybe someone had seen her. But then she did not show up for school. That mattered. Kei'Mani was not known as a child who disappeared. Her grandmother later said she had never run away before. This was not normal behavior. This was not a child who had a pattern of vanishing and returning when she felt like it. Then there was the phone. When family tried to reach her, it went straight to voicemail. Again, one detail by itself might not prove anything. But when every detail points in the same direction, fear starts to take shape. By just before noon on March 18th, Dorothy came back to the Elm Street home and saw what had been left behind and reported Kei'Mani missing. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was not the way it should have been. Things were out of place. The home was in disarray. The stove was on. There was the smell of gas. These were not the kind of details a family wants to find when a child is missing. Because now this was no longer just about Kei'Mani not answering her phone. Now the house itself looked wrong. And then came two of the most important details in those early hours. Her keys were still there. Her glasses were still there. That detail about the glasses stayed with people because Kei'Mani's family said she could not see without them. So the question became painfully simple. Why would a 13-year-old girl leave home without the very thing she needed to see? Why would she walk away without her keys? Why would she miss school? Why would her phone go silent? Why would the door be unlocked, the stove on, the smell of gas hanging in the air, while the child who lived there was nowhere to be found? At that point, this was not just a missing child report. It was a collection of warning signs stacked one on top of another. On Elm Street, there was no answer yet. No courtroom. No indictment. No public explanation. Just a family standing in the middle of a house that no longer felt like a home, looking at the things Kei'Mani left behind, and realizing that every minute she was gone made the fear heavier. A 13-year-old girl had vanished. And the first clues were not hidden. They were sitting right there in the place she should have been safest. As the 24-hour mark passed, the runaway theory crumbled. The FBI was called in. The Amber Alert system was scrutinized. But here is where the story takes a dark, psychological turn. Investigators began to notice something about Darnell, her father. While he was vocal, his stories began to shift. Small details, what she was wearing, the exact minute she left, began to conflict. Have you ever watched someone lie while knowing their life depends on it? Police in Toledo are trained to look for leakage. Those tiny moments where the mask of a grieving father slips. Darnell wasn't just grieving. He was managing the investigation. He was suggesting where they should look. He was trying to lead them away from a specific abandoned building on the 1000 block of North Michigan Street. Now, it was no longer just Dorothy Latigue looking around the house and trying to understand why her granddaughter's keys and glasses were still there. Now, Toledo was being asked to look for a 13-year-old girl. A missing juvenile case had begun. Family members shared her picture. Flyers went out. People were asked to pay attention, to check what they had seen, to think back to March 16th and March 17th. Every hour mattered, because Kei'Mani was not an adult who had chosen to leave and cut contact. She was a child. She had missed school. Her phone was not answering. Her family said she had never run away before. And when a child disappears under those circumstances, hope and fear sit side by side. Hope says she may still be found alive. Fear says the details at the house do not look right. For the public, the case started as a desperate search. The kind of search where people study a missing child's face and pray that someone, somewhere saw something. The goal was simple: find Kei'Mani and bring her home. During that search, her father, Darnell Jones, also known as Darnell Ogletree, spoke to local media. According to reporting, Jones claimed he had seen Kei'Mani late on March 16th. He reportedly said she had called him because she was afraid to be home alone. That detail placed him close to her in the final period before she vanished. At that moment, to many people watching from the outside, he may have looked like another parent caught in the panic of a missing child case. But investigators would later look at him differently. Reports said Jones was the last person known to be with Kei'Mani before she disappeared. That one fact changed the weight of everything he said. Because when the last known person with a missing child begins giving statements, every word matters. Every movement matters. Every gap matters. And investigators reportedly found problems. According to later reporting, Jones gave inconsistent statements about his activities and Kei'Mani's whereabouts. The search was still happening in public, but the focus of the investigation was starting to narrow. That is what makes this part of the case so painful. While people were passing out flyers and hoping to see Kei'Mani alive, investigators were beginning to question the story of one of the people closest to her. The search had two faces. On one side, there was the community effort, flyers, concern, family fear, and people trying to help. On the other side, there was the quiet movement of an investigation shifting from "where is Kei'Mani?" to who was with her before she disappeared. By March 23rd, authorities filed an abduction charge against Jones and issued a warrant for his arrest. That was the moment the case changed direction in public. Kei'Mani was still missing. Her family still did not have her home. But now, the search was no longer only about finding a child. It was becoming a search for answers from her own father. On March 24th, investigators went to an abandoned, burned house on Miami Street in Toledo. It was not a place where a child should have been. It was not a place connected to school, basketball, family routine, or any part of the life Kei'Mani should have been living. But inside that building, on the second floor, investigators found a body. The search for Kei'Mani was no longer a search. It had become a death investigation. The Lucas County Coroner's Office later confirmed what her family feared. The body was Kei'Mani Latigue. Her death was ruled a homicide. The autopsy found that she died from multiple incised wounds of the neck. National reporting later stated that Kei'Mani had been sexually assaulted, that her hands had been cut off, and that the injuries to her neck were so severe that a police official described her as nearly decapitated. These are hard facts to say out loud, and they are even harder to sit with. But they explain why this case gripped Toledo with so much anger and grief. This was not just a child found dead. This was violence carried out against a child in a way that no family, no school, and no city could forget. Kei'Mani hadn't just been killed. She had been subjected to an assault so brutal it left the forensic team in shock. The autopsy would later reveal that she had been nearly decapitated. The weapon? A sharp instrument used with a level of rage that suggested this wasn't just a heat-of-the-moment act. It was a calculated, prolonged execution. But if the world expected a confession or a show of remorse, they were disappointed. In his initial court appearances, Darnell did something that went viral for all the wrong reasons. He smiled. He looked at the cameras, he looked at Kei'Mani's grieving mother, and he smirked. But the smile faded when the DNA came back. 27 pieces of evidence. DNA under her fingernails. The final act of a 13-year-old girl fighting for her life against her own father. Forensic analysts found his digital footprint on her phone, showing he had been tracking her, monitoring her, and planning this final meeting for weeks. There was also confusion early in the public reporting. Local reports initially noted that sexual assault-related charges had not been filed at that point. But later, when the case moved forward through a grand jury indictment, rape charges were included among the charges against Jones. That matters because the legal record continued to develop after the first reports. And it is important to be clear, Darnell Jones has pleaded not guilty. The accusations against him are still being handled through the court system. For Toledo, this was the moment the case stopped being only about finding a missing girl. It became about the horror of where she was found, what had been done to her, and how the person accused was not a stranger waiting in the dark. It was her own father. That detail changed the way people heard the story. Because the person accused of taking her life was someone who should have protected it. Jones was located in Columbus. That is where the search for him turned into another dangerous confrontation. According to reports, Columbus police encountered Jones after he had been named as a suspect in Kei'Mani's death. During that confrontation, police said he allegedly pulled or fired a gun at officers. Officers then shot him. Jones survived. He was taken to the hospital, and for a short time, the man accused in one of Toledo's most painful child murder cases was not standing in a courtroom. He was under medical care, alive, while the child at the center of the case was gone forever. That contrast was hard for people to accept. Kei'Mani did not survive what happened to her. Jones did. And because he survived, the case did not end in Columbus. It moved forward. It moved toward charges. It moved toward court filings. It moved toward a prosecution that would eventually carry the possibility of the death penalty. That is when the public began to understand the size of the case building around him. This was not going to be a simple murder charge filed and forgotten. Prosecutors were preparing to treat Kei'Mani's death as a capital murder case, one of the most serious kinds of criminal cases the state can bring. From Elm Street to Miami Street, and then to Columbus, the path had already been devastating. A child disappeared. A community searched. A body was found. The father became the accused. And after a confrontation with police, he survived long enough to face the legal system. Now, the question was no longer only what happened to Kei'Mani. The question became whether the courtroom could prove who did it, and whether justice could ever be enough for a child who should have been turning 14. According to updated affidavits reported in the case, Jones allegedly admitted to detectives that he dragged Kei'Mani to the vacant house on Miami Street and killed her there. That statement, if proven in court, would place him directly at the location where Kei'Mani's body was found. And that is why this part of the case is so important. Because this was no longer only about suspicion. It was becoming a prosecution built around statements, recordings, witness interviews, digital material, and physical evidence. Prosecutors said the evidence in the case included more than 200 items. That number alone tells you how broad the investigation became after Kei'Mani was found. This was not a single report, a single witness, or one piece of evidence standing alone. The case file, according to prosecutors, included interviews, body camera material, video evidence, photo collections, voicemails, screenshots, and activity logs. Each item mattered because prosecutors were trying to build a timeline. They were trying to show where Kei'Mani was, who had contact with her, what Jones said before and after she disappeared, and what evidence connected him to the abandoned house on Miami Street. Court records also referenced interviews with several people tied to the case, including Jones himself, his former girlfriend, his cousin, and Kei'Mani's grandmother, Dorothy Latigue. That detail matters because investigations like this do not only look at the accused person. They look around him. They look at who spoke to him, who saw him, who heard from him, and who may have information about his movements. And in Kei'Mani's case, the people closest to the timeline became important. Her grandmother was connected to the Elm Street home where Kei'Mani disappeared. Jones was the father who investigators said was the last person known to be with her. His former girlfriend and cousin were also part of the interviews listed in the materials prosecutors described. On April 23, 2025, a Lucas County grand jury indicted Darnell Jones on more than a dozen charges connected to Kei'Mani's death. The list was severe: aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, aggravated burglary, endangering children, gross abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence. Each charge added another layer to what prosecutors believed happened between March 17th and March 18th, the period when they said the alleged crimes occurred. For Kei'Mani's family, those dates were not just numbers in a court file. They were the final stretch of a child's life. And for the public, the indictment made something clear. The state was not treating this as an ordinary murder case. Prosecutors attached death penalty specifications, meaning Jones could face the death penalty if convicted, and if the court process reaches that point under Ohio law. Because of that, he had to be appointed attorneys certified to handle a capital murder defense. That detail matters. A capital case moves differently. It carries more legal weight, more motions, more hearings, and more scrutiny. Every decision is examined. Every piece of evidence is challenged. Every word in the indictment matters. Lucas County Prosecutor Julia Bates later described the case as one of the most heinous sets of facts she had seen in more than 40 years working in the prosecutor's office. That is not a small statement. It came from someone who had spent decades around criminal cases, and still Kei'Mani's case stood out. On April 30th, 2025, Jones appeared for arraignment. He pleaded not guilty. That plea is important because the case is still ongoing. Jones is accused. Prosecutors have laid out serious allegations, but the court process has not yet reached a final verdict. After the arraignment, he was ordered held without bail. From that moment, the case moved into the long, painful process that often follows a capital murder indictment. Hearings, motions, legal challenges, and delays that can stretch grief across months and even years. The defense later challenged the death penalty specifications. In simple terms, they tried to remove the part of the case that could make Jones eligible for a death sentence if convicted. But Judge Michael Golding denied that request. That meant the death penalty specifications remained in place. Later, Jones' attorneys notified the court that he planned to raise a serious mental illness claim. Under Ohio law, if such a claim is successful, it could affect whether a defendant is eligible for the death penalty, even if convicted. So the case became even more legally complex. It was no longer only about whether prosecutors could prove the charges. It also became about what punishments could legally remain on the table if a conviction happened. And all of this was happening while Kei'Mani's family continued living with the reality that she was gone. Every court date meant hearing her name again. Every motion meant another reminder of what she never got to become. Every delay meant the people who loved her had to keep waiting. Reporting in 2026 said the trial, which had originally been expected earlier, had been pushed to October 19, 2026. That means Kei'Mani's case is not over. Not for the court. Not for her family. Not for the people in Toledo who followed the search, saw the memorials, and watched a missing child case become a capital murder prosecution. After the court filings began, Toledo still had another place where Kei'Mani Latigue's name was being spoken. Not only in the courtroom, not only on the news, but outside the abandoned house on Miami Street. Near the place where she was found, a memorial began to grow. One person came, then another, then more. People brought flowers, candles, stuffed animals, balloons, basketballs, signs demanding justice. Funeral arrangements turned into another heartbreaking part of the story. At a time when the family should have been united around saying goodbye to a child, there were disputes and hurt feelings over who was involved and how the services would be handled. Dale Riggs' funeral home later took over services after Brown Legacy Memorial was no longer handling them. Donations that had already been raised were expected to be transferred. Kei'Mani's mother, Tiara Caston, publicly expressed pain over not being included in funeral plans. She said she wanted to give her daughter a proper send-off. And whether people understood every part of the family disagreement or not, one thing was clear. This was grief on top of grief. Dorothy Latigue, Kei'Mani's grandmother, was also tied to the funeral and advocacy process, and she remained one of the central family figures connected to Kei'Mani's life, disappearance, and the fight for answers. Darnell Jones is currently awaiting his fate in the justice system, with a trial set to pull back the final curtain on his motives. But as we close this case, we don't end on the killer. We end on the girl. Kei'Mani Latigue wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, and a light in the city of Toledo. Her name should be remembered not for how she died, but for the life she lived. A life cut short by the one person who should have been her shield. If you found this investigation important, hit that subscribe button and share this video. The more people who know Kei'Mani's story, the harder it is for monsters like Darnell to stay in the shadows. We'll see you in the next investigation.